Okay, welcome everyone to today's webcast. I'm Sarah Seeloff, the Executive Director of the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and it is my pleasure to be here today with author Richard Rothstein, who's going to speak with us about his book, The Color of Law. So Richard spent 30 years as an as an education policy expert with the Economic Policy Institute. He's recently retired, and The Color of Law was published in 2017. He's going to speak with us today about the content of the book. You may also have seen or heard Richard on other outlets, including Fresh Air with Terry Gross and in various national news publications. CCLR was introduced to Richard via a former board member, and when I read The Color of Law, I thought, wow, this is such an important piece of history. It's really critical for helping land reuse professionals think about what our work means within the context of very recent American history. And I'm going to hand the floor over to Richard to walk us through the book. But I just want to say before we do that we are so pleased again to have all of you with us. This is CCLR's largest webinar that we have ever hosted. So Richard, thank you so much. I think everyone is really excited. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me begin, first of all, by thanking all of you for your interest in hearing this history this afternoon or this morning. You all know that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. The civil rights movement began actually in the 1930s when lawyers for the NAACP challenged segregation in law schools because they figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to understand that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they used that precedent to challenge racial segregation in colleges and universities. Using that precedent, they then went on to fight for the desegregation, the legal desegregation of elementary and secondary schools in the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954, with which you're familiar. And then the Brown case gave stimulus to a beginning civil rights movement that not only engaged in litigation and legislative demands, but in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives. And by the end of the 1960s, we had abolished segregation in everything from lunch counters to buses, interstate transportation of all kinds, public accommodations, swimming pools, water fountains. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much folded up its tent, went home, and left unaddressed the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either white or almost all white, clearly defined areas that were either black or almost all black. How could it be that we left unaddressed the biggest segregation of all? We came to understand in the 20th century that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to blacks and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How is it that we left the biggest segregation of all, residential segregation, to remain without being challenged? It's not that we've tried to demolish residential segregation and failed. We've never even tried. But partly, of course, it's because desegregating neighborhoods is a lot harder than desegregating buses. We pass an ordinance prohibiting the segregation of buses or withdraw an ordinance that requires it. The next day, you sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we pass an ordinance prohibiting residential segregation, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and this is what the book, The Color of Law, is about, is developed a national myth, a rationalization that excuses ourselves from addressing residential segregation, from continuing in the most important way the civil rights movement that began and ended in the 20th century. And that myth, that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that, Okay, are we together again? I was told that we cut off. What I was saying, I believe, when we cut off is that the myth that we've adopted is that residential segregation is entirely different from the other forms of segregation that we abolished. Segregation of schools or colleges or lunch counters or buses, those are all required by government policy, by law, by ordinance, by legislation. If it was the federal government that was creating and requiring segregation of those forms of life, that was a violation of the Fifth Amendment. If it was state and local governments that was doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. And as such, it was a civil rights violation. And if there's a civil rights violation, then we're obligated to remedy it if we want to maintain fidelity to our constitutional obligations. Residential segregation, we tell ourselves, is something entirely different. We say that it wasn't created by government, it wasn't created by law, by ordinance, by regulation. It happened sort of by accident. It happened because white homeowners wouldn't sell homes or rent apartments to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves that private actors, businesses in the private economy, not government agents like banks or real estate agents, discriminated in how they assigned real estate. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race. They self-segregate. Or maybe we say it's just an economic result. African Americans on average, not everyone, but on average have lower incomes than whites, and so they can't afford to move to white neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, private actions is what's created residential segregation, and we tell ourselves that if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. We give a name to this myth. We all use it. It's a myth and a name that's shared across the country by Democrats and Republicans, by liberals and conservatives, by Northerners and Southerners. We say we have de facto segregation of neighborhoods, unlike the de jure legal segregation of these other institutions. And the Supreme Court has embraced this notion, and the Supreme Court has told us that if we have de facto segregation, there's nothing we are permitted to do anything about it. If it wasn't created by government, government has no right to try to undo it. Well, as Sarah described to you before, I spent many, many years writing about education policy. And I came to focus particularly on what I thought was the absurdity of the education policies that this country was following in the 1990s and 2000s. We had this view. It was actually encapsulated in a federal law called No Child Left Behind, that the only reason that the average achievement of African American children was lower than that of white children was because teachers had low expectations of those black children, that they weren't held accountable for their performance. And the law said that if only we tested children more and held teachers and schools accountable for their performance, the achievement gap would disappear. And I thought this was an absurd notion, and I tried to explain in many of the articles and columns I was writing why that's the case. For example, I remember writing a column about asthma. Asthma afflicts African American children in urban areas at 4 times the rate of middle-class white children. African American children have high rates of asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, because their buildings are more deteriorated, because there's more vermin for families who are living in those neighborhoods. And if a child has asthma, the child is perhaps likely to be up at night, wheezing, comes to school drowsy the next day, sleepless, maybe even not come to school at all. And I tried to explain that if you had 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement, no matter how often the child is tested, no matter how high the teacher's expectations are. High expectations by teachers is not going to make a child wide awake if that child comes to school sleepless. And I went through case after case of these kinds of social and economic conditions. that affect children who are living in low-income segregated neighborhoods, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or stress from family economic insecurity. And when you add those all up, they explain a good part of the achievement gap. And then I began to think that it's one thing if a child comes to school with one of these conditions, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or stress. But what if you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions, where children are concentrated in single schools with these kinds of disadvantages? How absurd it is to have a national law which says that those schools are going to produce the same average achievement as schools where children come to school well-rested and not poisoned by lead paint and in secure homes with stable families that are economically stable. It can't be done. So I began to be concerned about segregated schools. I concluded that segregated schools was one of the most important causes of the achievement gap between African American and white children. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that concerned this very issue. The Supreme Court examined desegregation plans that have been implemented by the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them were concerned about the segregation of their schools. They adopted a choice plan, which allowed parents to choose which school in their neighborhood, in their district, the child would attend. But if you had a school that was all white or mostly all white, and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial program. How often do you have one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for it? But there was an effort to address the issue of segregation. The Supreme Court examined it, and the Supreme Court denounced it, said it was unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts said that the school districts of Louisville and Seattle had no right to attempt an explicit desegregation plan because Chief Justice Roberts said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. In fact, schools are more segregated today than at any time in the last 45 years, and it's because of neighborhood segregation. And he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto for all of the reasons I described before: private prejudice, actors in the private economy, self-choice, income differences. And he said if you have de facto segregation, it would be a violation of the Constitution itself to try to remedy it. Well, I read this decision. As I say, it concerned the districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And I remember the situation that occurred in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those districts, where a white homeowner in a single-family home in a suburb of Louisville called Shively had an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran with a wife and child, a middle-class income. He was living in a rented apartment in the center city of Louisville, and he wanted to move his family to a single-family home, and nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in the suburb of Shively bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, a mob, an angry white mob, surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows, but the police couldn't somehow identify any perpetrators. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police still couldn't find a single person to arrest for this violence. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to an African-American. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much to me like de facto segregation. Maybe there's something about the history of Louisville and maybe even other places that Chief Justice Roberts doesn't know. So I began the investigation that led to this book, The Color of Law. And what I found was, and I'm not exaggerating here, there were thousands of incidents of police-protected violence that drove African Americans out of homes they had legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods. Every one of those incidents where there was police protection and police oversight and not taking action to prevent that kind of violence was a 14th Amendment violation, a civil rights violation. And I found in the course of the research that I began that it wasn't just violence, government-sponsored violence that enforced racial boundaries in metropolitan areas like St. Louis, but that there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies that enforced, created, and sustained racial segregation in the 20th century, that those policies were so powerful that they created a system that still is in place today and that is responsible in large part for the continuation of the racial segregation that we have. The consequences of this segregation are enormous. It's not only the achievement gap in schools that I mentioned before, from the concentration of the most disadvantaged children in single schools, it's health disparities. African Americans have shorter life expectancies and greater rates of heart disease, for example, because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. The police violence that we see in places like Ferguson or Baltimore or many other places, and actually hundreds of places over the last 50 or 60 years, could not exist if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without jobs, access to jobs, or transportation even to get those jobs. I think the racial segregation that we have today is even in large part responsible for our very dangerous political polarization because it tracks racial lines, and how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's essential to the preservation of our democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to empathize with each other or identify with each other's life experiences? So the situation that we've created with government policy is very, very dangerous. Let me describe some of the policies in addition to police-protected violence that the government imposed in the 20th century. One of them is public housing. I think perhaps you may think you know what public housing is, a place where poor people live. That's not how public housing began. Public housing began in this country in the New Deal during the Depression. It was not for poor people. Poor people were not allowed into public housing. It was implemented by the Roosevelt administration as a program to provide housing for working families with stable incomes, good employment, because there was no housing available. Construction activity had stopped, and there was a housing shortage. And in order to have public housing, get into public housing, you had to have a good job and stable employment history. The government built public housing. The Public Works Administration was the first New Deal agency, and it built public housing in many cities in this country. And everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for African Americans and whites, frequently segregating communities that hadn't previously been segregated. That may surprise some of you, but in the mid-20th century, early 20th century, we had many, many more downtown integrated neighborhoods in this country that we have today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back into the 20th century to see the extent of residential segregation, integration, extent of residential integration that existed at that time, even in the South. Atlanta, which is one of the first locations of these public works projects, public projects, had an integrated neighborhood. It was about half black and half white, called the Flats. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were displaced to double up with relatives and find less adequate housing elsewhere. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he lived in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood when he grew up. He said in high school his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was not unique in 20th century America. I'm not saying it was commonplace, but it wasn't as unique as it would be today. Langston Hughes' neighborhood, the central neighborhood of Cleveland, had housing that was demolished by the Public Works Administration to build two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating segregation in that community that hadn't previously existed, and with other developments elsewhere in Cleveland, created a pattern of segregation that persists to this day, reinforced by other policies that I will describe in a few minutes. In my book, The Color of Law, I like where I can to focus on self-satisfied, smug places, like Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. Maybe some of you are from there. The neighborhood between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. Again, like the Atlanta Flats neighborhood, about half black and half white. Public Works Administration demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for blacks, and with that and other projects in the Boston metropolitan area, created and reinforced the pattern of segregation with a strength that otherwise wouldn't have existed. During World War II, the government's policy to create segregation intensified. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production during the war to take jobs that had been scarce during the Depression. If the government wanted the ships and the tanks and the aircraft to be produced, it had to provide housing for these workers. The communities where the war plants were located couldn't absorb them. And the government did. It built everywhere segregated housing. These were workers working in the same plants, the same shipyards, the same aircraft factories, but separate projects for white workers and black workers, creating, in many cases, for the first time in communities, of segregated patterns that hadn't previously existed. The West Coast is a good example. I'm here in Oakland today, speaking with you. Just north of Oakland is the city of Berkeley, and just north of that is a suburb of Berkeley called Richmond, which was the center of war production of ships during the World War II. There was no shipbuilding going on in that community before the war. After the war, by the end of the war, there were 100,000 workers in those shipyards, black and white. There was no real segregation in that community before because there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast before World War II. Not none, but very few relative to the rest of the country. The big migration of African Americans to the West Coast took place during World War II. The government built separate projects for African Americans and whites in Richmond and south into Berkeley and Oakland. The projects for the African Americans were located in Richmond and Berkeley along the railroad tracks, near the industrial area. Shoddy housing, because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans who came to the city for jobs during World War II would have to leave at the end of the war. The housing for whites was more stable in the more residential areas of Richmond, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise would never have developed. There was no pattern of segregation on the West Coast prior to World War II because there were not enough African Americans to segregate. The segregation that we know today in places like Portland and Seattle and the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles is all attributable to government policy that segregated the migrants who came to that area during the war. After the war, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Not only had very little housing been built during the Depression, except for those projects, public projects that I described. During World War II, it was actually against the law to use construction materials for civilian purposes, unless it was for war workers' housing. And after the war, millions of returning war veterans were coming home, needing housing. And there was no housing available for them. We had a national housing crisis then that was comparable to the one we have today. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, had to address this housing crisis, and he proposed an expansion of public housing. Remember, public housing was not for poor people. It was for working class families, returning war veterans at this point, who had jobs in the post-war economy, who could afford to pay rent. Public housing wasn't subsidized. The families in public housing paid the full cost of it in their rent. It was the best housing available to working class families. Truman proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's public housing program. And not for racial reasons, because it was always segregated, and they had no objection to that, and not because they had liked poor people, because public housing wasn't for poor people. For the most part, there were no poor people living in public housing. They wanted to oppose it because they thought public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be in the housing market. The private sector should be taking care of it. Even though the private sector in those days wasn't doing any housing for working class families. It was only building housing for the affluent. And so Truman proposed a vast expansion of this program. Conservatives wanted to defeat it, and they came up with a strategy that we refer to today as a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy in Congress is one where conservatives, or any opponents really of a bill, who want to defeat a bill, put forward an amendment that they think can get a majority. But when the full bill comes up on the floor of Congress with that amendment attached, a different majority now finds the bill unpalatable because of that amendment. So the way it worked in the case of Truman's public housing program was like this. Conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the National Housing Act of 1949 that said from now on there can't be any racial discrimination in public housing. No more segregated public housing. It was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for the amendment. They planned to get some northern liberals to vote for it as well, enough northern liberals to create a majority. The amendment would then pass, and when the full bill came up before the floor of the Congress, House and Senate, the conservatives planned to flip, vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who were opposed to integrated housing but not to segregated housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress had to decide whether to fall into this trap, whether to vote against the integration amendment in order to preserve public housing, vote against their principles in order to preserve public housing, or vote for the integration amendment and ensure that no housing would be built to address the enormous housing crisis that we faced. I'm not suggesting it was an easy decision. It was a very difficult decision. The housing crisis was real. But they decided, in order to create housing, to campaign against the integration amendment. The leaders of that fight, liberals against the integration amendment, were Hubert Humphrey, who was known as Mr. Civil Rights in the United States Senate. His leader was another senator from Illinois, Paul Douglas. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." In retrospect, I don't think we were better off. He succeeded in defeating that amendment. The final Housing Act was passed as a continued segregated program. The federal government then used that vote in Congress as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. The consequence of the enormous expansion of segregated housing that took place after the passage of that act is what I described before: an achievement gap in schools, health disparities between African Americans and whites, violence between police and young men, and mass incarceration, and political polarization. Of course, had liberals taken a different road and voted for the integration amendment, we would have had a bigger housing crisis. But whether that is comparable to the crisis that we face today in our segregated society is, I think, something that we need to carefully consider. Well, very soon after this, public housing was built, expanded after the 1949 Housing Act. A development occurred that was quite surprising to policy experts, to housing experts, and that is that the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. The black projects had long waiting lists. It was a puzzle. Why would that happen? These were all returning war veterans, or most of them returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war economy. Why would there be long waiting lists on the black projects and vacancies in the white ones? The reason is another federal program, which I will describe in a minute, but the vacancies in the white projects became so obvious and unsustainable, indefensible, that even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation in his city where some projects had long waiting lists and others had large vacancies. And so eventually all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Public housing became, for the first time, a predominantly African American institution. At about the same time, industry left the cities. We had integrated neighborhoods in the 20th century, as I described earlier, because industry had to be located near deep water ports, near railroad terminals, so workers could walk to work. They didn't have automobiles, and so they had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. But now industry was leaving the cities, moving to rural areas that no longer needed to be located near railroad terminals or deep water ports. Highways were being built. Industry could get its parts and ship their final products by truck. So good jobs disappeared from urban areas. The African Americans who are now living in public housing became poorer and poorer. Public housing now had to be subsidized. Families could no longer pay the rent that they needed to pay the full costs of public housing. Once it became subsidized, the government stopped investing in it, stopped maintaining it, the projects deteriorated, and we got the kind of public housing that we associate with public housing today. The question is, why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the black ones? And that's because of another federal program, as I said a minute ago, by the Federal Housing Administration, designed to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes in exclusive white suburbs. It was an explicit white racial program. There was nothing unintentional about it. And you're familiar with the suburbs that were created everywhere in this country, beginning in the 1940s and 50s and 60s for whites only. Every metropolitan area in this country is now ringed by a white noose of suburban communities that were created and subsidized by the Federal Housing Administration. The most famous of them is probably Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. Another one that perhaps you're familiar with, maybe you remember hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all looked the same. It was written by Malvina Reynolds. That's about a development that was just about as large as Levittown. This one was 15,000 homes south of San Francisco, a community called Westlake. And Los Angeles became the symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s, and communities like Panorama City or Lakewood or Westchester in the Los Angeles area were all FHA, Federal Housing Administration, subsidized developments for whites only. A builder like Levitt, who built Levittown, or Henry Dolger, who built the little boxes on the hillside, or any of the other builders, hundreds and hundreds of these developments across the country, could never have assembled the capital on their own to buy the land and to build these projects. Remember, we weren't a suburban country at that time. Nobody even thought that people would be willing to move into a suburban community of single-family homes when they'd been living in cities all their lives. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money to build 17,000 homes on a speculation that people would want them. The only way that Levitt could build that development, or any of these other developers could build it, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, including what construction materials they're going to use, how the suburb would be laid out, what the design of the homes were, and a commitment made to the Federal Housing Administration never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required these developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the Federal Housing Administration. It was explicit federal policy. It was written out in the federal policy manual that the FHA distributed, the Federal Housing Administration distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend to the FHA bank guarantees for developers like Levitt and Dolger and all the others. The manual explicitly prohibited federal bank guarantees for builders of developments that would be integrated. The manual even prohibited the construction of an all-white development if it was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the manual said. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photo of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall constructed by a builder in Detroit to separate his development from a nearby African-American neighborhood. The wall was required by the Federal Housing Administration before they would guarantee his loans. There was nothing de facto segregation about this. This is all explicit racial policy designed to create segregation. And as I said, these policies had enormous consequences, and I'm going to describe one more before I close and we can have questions. Those homes in the suburbs like Levittown or Westlake or Panorama City sold in the mid-20th century for about $100,000 in today's money. In those days, it was $8,000 or $9,000. About twice national median income. Any working class family, black or white, can afford to buy a home for twice national median income, especially in those days if they were returning war veterans. And the VA, which had a similar program to the FHA, required no down payment. Those returning war veterans could pay less in their monthly housing costs to move into a development like Levittown or Westlake or any of the others than they'd been paying for rent in public housing. That's how much the subsidy was. Today, those homes no longer sell for $100,000. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some parts of the country, even much more. The white families who were subsidized to purchase those homes gained over the next few generations wealth from the gain in equity, from the equity appreciation of their homes. African Americans who were required by federal policy to continue living in cities, renting apartments, gained none of that wealth. The white families who gained that wealth used it to send their children to college, to take care of emergencies if they had them, unemployment, temporary unemployment perhaps, or medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their own children who had the funds now to make down payments on their own homes. African Americans had none of that wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that we have never remedied and never accepted the obligation to remedy because of this myth of de facto segregation. The policies to remedy segregation, to redress segregation, are easy to develop. We know what they are. They're not hard. What's difficult is developing the political will to enforce those policies, to adopt them, and to demand them. We need a new civil rights movement that's going to engage in all the tactics, if necessary, and perhaps new ones, to demand civil rights reforms that can redress segregation. I can mention a few of them, but as I say, it's really foolish to spend a lot of time talking about policy when we don't have yet the political will. I am working with a group of civil rights leaders to attempt to begin a new national organization, tentatively called the Committee to Redress Segregation, that will hopefully mobilize people and communities around the country to demand these kinds of policies. Those of you who are in contact with me, I'll be glad to notify you when the National Committee is announced. It could be a year from now, hopefully not too much longer than that. But that's what it's going to take, a new civil rights movement. The policies, I say, are easy. We could, for example, be subsidizing African Americans to purchase homes that are now unaffordable to them in communities from which they were excluded when they were affordable. That would be one way to remedy this policy. We today follow policies for low-income families that reinforce segregation. It's actually the same kind. It's analogous to the devil's bargain that we made when Paul Douglas and Hubert Humphrey campaigned against the desegregation amendment. The low-income housing tax credit is the largest policy that we use to subsidize the housing of low-income families. It's a tax credit for developers to build affordable housing. But the low-income housing tax credit, which is a federal Treasury Department program, results in most of the affordable housing being built in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing segregation. Builders would rather build there because the land is cheaper, and they don't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining to white neighbors why they're bringing black and brown people into their neighborhoods. And it's easier to rent apartments if you build an affordable housing development in a low-income neighborhood, because people can walk by, see a for rent sign in the window. So the result is we reinforce segregation with this program in the same way that Douglas chose to build affordable housing, that is public housing, rather than confront the need to have a desegregation program. The same thing is true of the Section 8 program, which perhaps more of you are familiar with. It's a subsidy to families to purchase homes, not to purchase, well, sometimes to purchase homes, mostly to rent homes at market rates when their incomes aren't sufficient to do so. The Section 8 program also reinforces segregation today, because most Section 8 voucher holders are only able to use those vouchers in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. Landlords elsewhere refuse to accept them. The result is that it reinforces segregation. Both of those programs would be easy to reform in order to redress segregation. In the Section 8 program, we could prohibit the right of landlords to discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders. We could, in the case of the low-income housing tax credit, we could place a priority on the allocation of those tax credits to developers who are willing to build mixed-income housing in high-opportunity communities. So the policies to address this, to redress segregation, are not easy, not hard to conceive of. What's hard is developing the political will that will enable us to move forward and create the desegregated society that is essential to the preservation of our democracy. I want to thank you for your attention. I understand there may be questions, and I'd be glad to take them and try to answer them if I can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. And yes, please do send your questions. You can see in the bar of tools off to one side of your screen that you have the opportunity there to submit questions, and so we have ample time. And Richard, we have a question asker here who was reading my mind. Opportunity zones. You were talking about high opportunity neighborhoods. Opportunity zones are out there in the public discourse. Everybody's talking about them. Thoughts about, given the history that you've discussed here, how should that influence the way that cities and communities are thinking about and approaching opportunity zones?
Opportunity zones is just a new name for a program that we've attempted for, I guess, 60 years, and it's never worked. The effort to invest in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods with the illusion that you can have separate but equal communities is an illusion. We started with the Model Cities program in the Johnson administration in the 1960s. That did not convert low-income African-American neighborhoods into high-opportunity places. We then had enterprise zones and empowerment zones in the Clinton administration. That did not succeed. Giving tax breaks to businesses to locate in low-opportunity places does not turn those into high-opportunity places. So long as the most disadvantaged families are concentrated in single neighborhoods, the segregation will continue and the vast difference in opportunity will continue. Of course, we should invest in those neighborhoods. We should try to make life better for people who live there. But the notion that we can create separate but equal communities is an illusion. Those programs to invest in low-income neighborhoods, I'm not opposed to them, but they should be complemented by much more powerful programs that create opportunities for those families who want to live in higher opportunity places to do so.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. The questions are coming fast and furious, so keep them coming to all of our participants. Next question. We had a question about the differences in wealth that you mentioned between white and African-American populations. What's the difference? What's at the root of that? Incomes? Housing values? How do we break it down and understand it?
Well, as I said before, the African-American incomes on average are about 60% of white income, 60%. The reason for that, federal policy has a lot to do with it. You'll have to invite me back for another long lecture to explain the income gap.
Sounds good.
That's a different issue. But given that, you would think that an average income ratio of 60% would generate an average wealth ratio that's somewhere close to 60%. The reason it doesn't is primarily because of housing values, because of wealth. The main way that middle-class families in this country gain wealth is through the equity they have in their homes. When African Americans are prohibited, and were prohibited in the 20th century, from buying homes when they were affordable, in neighborhoods where the property values would rise, they gained none of that wealth. And so I think that the evidence shows that given the fact that the 60% income ratio, the difference between that income ratio and the 10% wealth ratio, I think is entirely or largely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policies, the explicit prohibition of African Americans to purchase homes when they were affordable in the suburban communities that later appreciated in the value and gave wealth to the owners of those homes.
Richard, another question here. How can we stay up to date on the Committee for Redressing Segregation?
Well, you can either send me an email note telling me that you want to be informed, and I will put you on a list to get the announcement when it happens. I suppose that's the best way. Perhaps I can work out with Sarah a way of getting your contact information if you're interested from the participants in this webinar. It's information. It takes a while to develop this kind of thing, and I don't expect an announcement to be made in the next few months, but it will be made, I'm confident, before too long, and I would welcome your participation in it.
And for those who may not be familiar with the committee, Richard, can you give us just a brief bit of background about where it is, where it's coming from?
Well, there is no background at this point. It's information. We have a group of planners. They're made up of nationally known civil rights leaders as well as others, representatives of, for example, both the White Real Estate Agents Association and the Black Real Estate Agents Brokers Association. It's, as I say, got civil rights leaders involved, and we're developing that plan. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of fundraising to do. In order to be able to support this, the idea is to have local committees in as many places we can begin them, to begin to organize around issues of redressing segregation. For example, there are many, and the first step obviously has to be education, more education of people about the constitutional imperative, the moral imperative to do something about this. In my book, for example, I describe the fact that our history textbooks used in high schools and in middle schools lie about this history. I describe, I've looked at the most commonly used American history textbooks in this country. None of them tell the truth about this. The most popularly used American history textbook, as I write in The Color of Law, only explains segregation by saying that African Americans found themselves in segregated neighborhoods. That's the explanation for it. No mention, not even an allusion to the fact of government action. Well, this committee, for example, will be developing alternative curriculum units that teachers can use to teach this history. And committee members will be taking them to schools. Everybody knows teachers and principals and school board members and superintendents, and taking them to schools, trying to get them to adopt them, and engaging perhaps in pressure campaigns to insist on their adoption. And I'm quite confident that if we start a conversation in schools about how it's being taught, that conversation will leak out into the broader community. Many, many white neighborhoods today still have those covenants, those restrictive covenants on their deeds that prohibit resale to African Americans. They're no longer enforceable, but they're still on the deeds of homeowners. Many people are unaware of them. I'd say most people are unaware of the fact that those deeds on their own homes have that kind of action. So we may begin by mobilizing communities to require that the city clerk or the recorder of deeds, or wherever it is in different states, take action to remove those deeds. These things I both talked about are symbolic actions. They're not actually redressing segregation, but they're the kind of actions to begin with to create the climate of opinion that will make more aggressive action actually to create desegregated opportunities more realistic.
Great. One follow-on to that question, Richard, have you considered partnering with the new Poor People's Campaign to build the political will for redressing segregation?
Well, yes. As I say, this is in development. We're considering partnering with a lot of organizations that have similar interests. We will not be trying to compete with anybody who's doing something already in this area, but creating opportunities where it doesn't already exist. But yes, we're going to be partnering with many, many organizations like that.
Great. Switching gears just a little bit, I have a question here from, and I'm just going to go ahead and read this. The question says, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling with an older laptop here. Not that I don't agree with everything you have said here, but it's not just about blacks and whites. I am Choctaw, American Indian, and I'm interested in what you have found on this subject concerning Native Americans, whether rural, i.e. reservations, or urban.
Yeah, well, my book, In the Color of Law, is about policies that were implemented to segregate African Americans. That's not to say that there weren't other criminal policies that were followed in other cases. Certainly the policies of genocide that were followed against American Native Americans and to concentrate them and herd them into reservations were equally obnoxious and offensive and need remedies. That's just not the topic of this particular book. There are other books about that, and I hope there will be more. And I'm certainly not suggesting, and I don't mean to suggest, that the segregation of African Americans is the only problem that this country faces. But I also think it's important to distinguish them, not to think that all policies that discriminated against and worse against minorities were similar. They were different kinds of policies. They require different remedies and had different applications.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. So we've been talking a lot about the role of government in facilitating segregation. Thinking about land reuse, I'm going to start with just a question about how does housing policy and segregation in housing policy influence industrial development and what we see today in so many low-income communities and communities of color, i.e. that there's a concentration of brownfield properties, of properties that are contaminated or maybe contaminated, they're blighted. Take it away. It
happened in both ways, and I described some of this in The Color of Law in my book. In some cases, polluting industries were located in neighborhoods where African Americans were living. That's where policymakers with discriminatory intent located them. It's also where residents have the least political power to protest against those locations. It's also the case that African Americans moved disproportionately to neighborhoods where industry was located, polluting industry was located, because that's where the only place that was open to them, the only place that was affordable. So in some cases, polluting industry moved to neighborhoods where African Americans were concentrated after they were already concentrated, and then the location of that industry made the movement of African Americans to those neighborhoods more likely. The federal government did studies demonstrating that there was a vastly disproportionate location of polluting industry in neighborhoods where African Americans live. It's another thing that's never been remedied.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Now, I know when you came into our offices before we started this webinar, you mentioned that you really tried to take a national perspective, but you're here in California. So I'm going to ask you a question about California policy, but I think it has relevance to the rest of the country. So we've talked a lot about the role of the public sector. Let's talk about the private sector. California abolished redevelopment tools for local government in 2012. Redevelopment agencies went away. And this question asker wants to know, what is the role, or how can we depend on the private sector to clean up environmental contamination, assemble irregular, underutilized properties, and create decent, safe, and sanitary housing? So maybe put another way, what is the role of the private sector in helping to redress segregation and facilitate redevelopment that works for everyone?
The private sector responds to incentives that government has to create. There's no such thing as a free market, and I don't think that the private sector on its own can do much to redress segregation unless the federal government creates the incentives for it to do so, or state or local governments create the incentives for it to do so. When I talked before about the policies that are easy to conceive, that there's no political will for to redress segregation, I didn't mention perhaps one of the more important ones, and that is zoning ordinances that exist in every state in the country. Well, maybe not in Texas, but in every state in the country that effectively excludes housing for moderate and low-income residents from many communities. Those zoning ordinances need to be abolished. There's no way that the private sector can build mixed-income housing in a high-opportunity community if that community is zoned for single-family residences only, sometimes even on large lot sizes. So the zoning has to be addressed before the private sector can take advantage of opportunities that presently don't exist.
Okay. So one of the challenges of reintegrating housing is that the same federal law that once pushed segregation now prevents programs that target minority populations for housing. What is the best way to address this constitutionally and to allow government programs to favor previously disfavored populations?
Well, so long as we believe that segregation is de facto, that it was created by accident, there is no constitutional challenge that's possible to it. We have to understand, there has to be a much broader understanding of the fact that this is a civil rights violation. Once there's public understanding of that civil rights violation, the courts will follow, and it will be possible to mount constitutional challenges, for example, to the disparate placement of low-income housing tax credit developments in low-income communities, to the zoning ordinances that effectively exclude minorities from communities that were created with a racially explicit purpose, and whose segregation is perpetuated by facially race-neutral policies. Unless we understand the history, unless we understand the constitutional context in which segregation was created, the possibilities for challenge are somewhat limited. It's not to say that we can't undertake some kinds of litigation at this point, not on a constitutional basis. The Fair Housing Act does permit challenges to housing policies that have what's called a disparate impact on minority families, but the courts aren't very friendly to those kinds of lawsuits. We don't have the political climate, the civil rights movement that's demanding a different approach. I am not pessimistic at all about whether the courts will respond if we do have that kind of national pressure. Courts always respond to public opinion and to public pressure. I'm reminded frequently of how in the 1930s, every New Deal program in the labor market that the New Deal attempted was struck down by the Supreme Court. They said minimum wage laws were unconstitutional. They said health and safety laws were unconstitutional. They said child labor laws were unconstitutional, all on the guise of interfered with the freedom of contract between workers and their employers, even children and their employers. And then when the political pressure got great enough, the Supreme Court suddenly said, whoops, maybe these things aren't so unconstitutional after all. So the same thing is what we should expect if sufficient political will develops to face up to our responsibilities to redress segregation.
We're going to come back to the question of political will in just a moment, but coming back to the question of zoning, can you comment on the upzoning of parcels in communities that have high opportunities? Does this really lend to having lower income households benefiting from these policies?
Well, the policies to redress segregation are complicated, and we don't have time to go into them in great detail, but we need to make a distinction between two different types of policies. One is exclusionary zoning, which prevents anything from typically single-family homes on large lot sizes from being constructed. The other is inclusionary zoning, which is a requirement that new development include a share of units for low and moderate and market rate housing. They're not the same. You can abolish exclusionary zoning and not create the requirement for inclusionary zoning. Abolishing exclusionary zoning is a step in the right direction. The city of Minneapolis, for example, recently abolished exclusionary zoning throughout the entire city. It's no longer permissible to have a single-family zoned neighborhood or lot in the city of Minneapolis. It permits up to 3 units to be built on lots that were zoned for single families only. But it doesn't go the step further and requiring that one of those units be affordable to any but the wealthy. So both policies are necessary. I'm not minimizing the step that Minneapolis took. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not going to create opportunity for redressing segregation. If all it does is create more opportunities for tech workers and others with small families who can afford to pay high rents to do so.
So coming back to the question of political will, I'm going to link 2 questions together from our listeners here. How might local governments make changes when federal policies are outside of our control? Are there actors outside of governments that might be able to confront this challenge where political will is absent? And I'm going to tack onto that. And how would you measure it? What kinds of metrics have you seen or would you suggest to measure equity at the local level?
Well, I certainly didn't mean to imply that all policies to redress segregation are federal. There are many things that can be done at the local level. It varies from state to state. As you all probably know, different states permit localities to have authority over different areas. And in some cases, if localities take steps to try to redress segregation, conservative state legislators that are dominated by rural interests preempt them and prohibit them from doing so. But for example, I mentioned before that there are a few communities in the country that prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. That's a local policy. Sometimes it can be a state policy. The state may not permit, a local jurisdiction to enact such a prohibition, but in some cases it may be possible. The allocation of low-income housing tax credits is another policy that states and localities, local housing districts have control over, local jurisdictions have control over in some places. So there are many policies that can be enacted at a local level if the state permits them, and there are many policies that can be enacted at the state level if possible.
Great. And I just want to say that for everyone who has asked, we will be including a question in our follow-up evaluations so that we can make sure that you stay in touch and receive updates. I think there's a lot of interest here. Let's talk about sprawl. So do you see regions with higher degrees of unincorporated sprawl coming across as measurably more inequitable in terms of federal, state, and local resources being distributed across the population compared to municipally unified, dense, and diverse regions?
I really don't know. I have to say, if I may, that as you said, I spent much of my recent life studying education policy. I knew nothing about housing. I'm now being forced to become a pseudo-faux housing expert, being dragged into it. And there's a lot I don't know and a lot I still need to know. But I will say this. There is, of course, variation across the country in the extent to which a segregation exists. There's hardly a community I go to talk about this that people don't want to convince me that in one way or the other their community is worse than any other. And in some cases they may be right. But I think it's important not to focus on the marginal differences, but instead on the underlying reality. It's always easier to focus on how places are different, even though in most ways they're the same. And residential segregation that I described is common across the country. Of course, there are degrees of where it exists. In particular, it's more intense in places that had African American populations that were longer lasting, that brought African Americans to the north, for example, during the first Great Migration, places like Detroit and Chicago, less intense in places that were not subject to the first Great Migration. But every place is segregated, and we need to address it wherever it exists.
So I think gentrification and displacement are issues that many cities are struggling with, many activists, many land recyclers, many city staff. So let's talk a little bit about gentrification. I have a question, and I'm going to connect to, first, can you share your thoughts on gentrification, especially gentrification that is happening in neighborhoods of color now, especially as those neighborhoods might gain more opportunities, for example, a train station? What policies can help fight displacement? And then connected to that, is there a special role for land trusts?
Okay, I'm not going to answer about land trusts. I'm told that there's a special role for them, but I don't claim to be an expert in things I don't know anything about. I'm glad you asked about gentrification. It's usually the first question that comes up, not the last one. It's an enormous problem in low-income neighborhoods in cities like San Francisco and New York and even Austin and Washington. We know easily what to do to make gentrification a positive force. It's an example of what I talked about before. We know what the policies are. We don't have the will to implement them. Gentrification could be a terrific thing. Every community should have a mix of moderate, low income, and affluent market rate housing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what communities should look like. What's happening, though, with gentrification is that it's converting, in many cases, previously segregated low-income neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods in particular, into now segregated high-income, mostly white neighborhoods, because we're not controlling it. There are two kinds of things we need to control gentrification. One is to preserve the opportunity of families who lived in these neighborhoods to remain. And we know how to do that. We should have, for example, rent control that prohibits landlords from raising rents beyond inflation when a neighborhood's values start to appreciate. We should have limits on condominium conversions. We should have inclusionary zoning so that when new developments, new projects are created in those neighborhoods, a share of them have to be reserved for low and moderate income families. And we should have a freeze on property taxes for existing homeowners. I know that those of you in California are going to say that's a terrible idea because it freezes schools revenues, and California schools went from among the best in the country to the worst in the country when we froze property taxes. But we can freeze property taxes without that result simply by recouping the lost property taxes from the capital gains at point of sale, but freezing them for as long as existing homeowners wish to live in their homes. So there are many policies we could follow to prevent gentrification from converting one kind of segregation to the opposite kind of segregation. But we also have to acknowledge that some families will always be displaced. In a market economy, you can't prevent some people from willingly selling their property to people who are going to develop it, even if it's inclusionary for the development. And in that case, we need policies that are going to ensure that the people who are displaced have high opportunity places to go to. In most cases where gentrification takes place, the displaced minority, mostly African American families who are forced out of their gentrifying neighborhoods are simply forced into new segregated, low opportunity neighborhoods, and in many cases have even worse opportunity than the places from which they were displaced. And for that problem, we need the kinds of policies that I described before, the reform of zoning ordinances that permit those families to move, to relocate to higher opportunity communities, reforms in the Section 8 and low-income housing tax credit developments, and so forth. So both kinds of policies are necessary. Policies that preserve the right of families who want to remain in their communities to do so, with rent control, with inclusionary zoning, with limits on condominium conversions and so forth, and policies that permit those who are displaced to be displaced to high opportunity communities, not to newly segregated low-income places.
Great. There are so many excellent questions that our listeners have submitted, and we are not going to have time to get to all of them, but like I said, we will be circulating an evaluation, and you can share your contact information with us so that you can keep participating in this conversation, because it's about building the conversation, right? I'm going to put in one last question here, Richard, and that is that CCLR and our supporters and the folks who are on this webinar are all about improving lives by improving communities. And so what role can those of us who are in the land recycling field dealing on a daily basis with questions of redevelopment play in helping to take what you've laid out in this book and implement it through our projects and ultimately build stronger, more inclusive communities?
Well, I really can't tell you that. I can't answer that question. I've given you, I think, some information that you can apply to different situations. Every situation is different, but I think that if we keep in mind that the policies that we are now following mostly have the unintended consequence of reinforcing segregation. Most of the policies that we're following do not challenge the segregation that exists. And if we keep that in mind, I'm sure in all the locations where your participants in this webinar are working, they can find ways to apply that insight. Let me say one other thing. I don't know if you're permitted to do this, but if there are unanswered questions that you want to forward me, I'll be glad to answer them by email to the people who've asked them. That's excellent. We have some unanswered questions, so if you did submit a question and I wasn't able to get it on the air, then thank you so much, Richard. That is very generous of you. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I think this is a really important conversation here at CCLR. We plan to continue this with further installations in our national webinar series. But we are just really thrilled that you could be here with us, Richard, and thank you so much for bringing this important book and research into this conversation. We definitely, if you haven't read the book, shameless plug, go read it. And I would just say that if you, when you do read the book, one of the things that I personally appreciated a great deal, Richard, is that you include a section on frequently asked questions in the back, which I think is really insightful and really helps tie the history in the book to our the current age and the policy choices and problems that we face. So with that, thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and we will be in touch with our evaluation. Tell us what you thought, and sign up to stay in touch and further the discussion. Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you.